What does it mean for consonant inventory to be naturalistic? So this is our kind of research question. This is why we've picked up the paper to begin with. God. Oh God. Windows. Yeah, okay, I gotta find those windows again. Okay, good. Yeah, we're back. Is the font big enough for you? I think I might need to... where's the... Ah, there we go. Great. Goodness gracious, YouTube. Welcome back. It is good to see you here. We're about to jump into a new kind of segment called Research With Me. And in this segment, we are going to be reading a linguistics paper together and trying to see what we can get out of it. And so today, we are going to be reading... we're going to be reading a new paper that's come out in Linguistic Typology in the journal this year, 2022, called A Typology of Consonant-Inventory Gaps. So, chat, this is the reveal. We're going to be looking at some phonological typology today, at least first. We have some other papers that we're going to look at later. But first, we're going to jump in with some phonological typology and look at consonant inventory gaps. So let's scoot over to this side webcam, and we have our setup here. We have on the left the paper. I may need to move my camera at some point, but we'll see how we do. On the left the paper, and on the right the notes. And we have a really cool feature of the journal Linguistic Typology. You can see is that they give IPA for their authors. So this is Nikolaev 2022, this paper. So let's do our very first thing, and let's write in Nikolaev 2022. This is the format that I take my notes in, just to put the citation there, and then I like the title in the title of the note as well. Cool. So we are going to try and get out of this something useful for us. So this is the first kind of tip, is when you're approaching a linguistics paper, or a paper in any field, but I'll stick to what I know, it's good to go in with kind of a goal. You'll end up not being as effective if you just go into the paper and say, paper, teach me everything that you have inside. It's better if you come in with a question that you're curious about, that you're trying to get an answer to or trying to get more information on. And then that way that sort of helps those aspects of the paper leap out at you. So it will generally be a pretty significant waste of time to try and exhaustively extract all the information from a paper, at least on the first read through. And it's not always worth it. I mean, I'm not going to say anything about any particular paper, but there are some papers that are very central and important, and some papers that are less so, and they're more minor, and you don't want to spend as much time on them as you do on the really central ones that are going to help you. Okay, so yeah, we have Jake, you're right. We have Obsidian up on the right here. This is not my main vault for Obsidian. This is one that's special for YouTube, because I think all my little doohickeys and things would get in the way. But nevertheless, really great program. If you aren't using Obsidian, you don't know about it, check it out. It's very cool. All right. So, okay, we have a question. Cicinho is asking, where do we get these papers? Well, luckily, we have certain journals which have open access. And Linguistic Typology is a journal that has open access for some of its articles, at least. So we can go onto, you go to the journal's website. Here it is, Linguistic Typology. You look in issues, say volume 26, issue 1, and then you can see what is open access. So there's one on appositive possession in Ainu and around the Pacific. Interesting. And here is our paper here, A Typology of Consonant Inventory Gaps. And then you just go in. You can read it in HTML, which some people might like, but then you get ugly things like, where is it? I saw something ugly. Actually, this looks kind of nice. Well, sometimes you get, yeah. So the figures end up just being sort of plopped in there with this white background, and if you're in the dark mode, it's not as nice. But you can read it here, or you can read it as it was sort of intended to be read in the, no, that's not the paper. Where is it? I've lost it. There we go. In the PDF. So, okay, so typology. Oh, that's a great question. Echo, thank you. Typology is the study of the variation in human languages. and what the nature and limits of that variation is. So typology is probably the most relevant part of linguistics for people making constructed languages that are naturalistic, because typology is going to give you basically all of your information as to ideas of what's a possible human language. So typology, depending on how you want to approach it, can answer things like, what is the range of variation in human languages? What is a possible human language? What's another good question that typology can answer? Are there associations between different kinds of language, different traits in language? How do we distinguish between the effects of genetic relatedness, so languages in the same family, from areal influence, languages that are sort of live around each other start to become more alike sometimes, and then similarities that arise due to the sort of structure of how language works. So some aspect about the human mind or the human body that makes language look the way it does. So that is that's the gist of typology. Hopefully I've given it a fair shake. It's a particularly beloved field for me. It's what I wrote my dissertation on. And so in typology papers, you'll see a concern with expressing language universals. So things that are purportedly true of all languages. You'll see things like ideas of, well, universals. I'll come to the full screen because this is kind of narrative-y. Linguistic universals, which are things that are true of all languages. You also have things like statistical universals, which are things that are true of most languages, kind of stretching the definition of universal there a bit, I think. Implicational universals. So you'll have, if a language has this feature, it'll also have this other feature. So having feature A implies having feature B. Those are implicational universals, and there are a lot of implicational universals that have been proposed. So typology is all over that. Yeah, so typology is fun. Typology it interacts with theoretical linguistics, because you want a linguistic theory to generate so if you have a theory about how language works, it should be compatible with the kinds of languages that exist. So you often see a kind of give and take between theories of language structure and theories of language variation, or linguistic diversity. You also have an interaction between historical linguistics and typology. So when you are reconstructing when you're reconstructing proto-languages, you want to reconstruct a language that is typologically valid or typologically realistic. So you generally don't want your reconstructed language to look unlike every other language that has been described. And then there are fierce debates over what the role of typology should be in theoretical linguistics and in historical linguistics as well. And I will one day rant about all of that, because that is a very dear topic to my heart. So, yeah, where were we? We're talking about typology, and we're talking about a typology of constant inventory gaps. So let's take that idea of typology that I introduced and apply it to something concrete. So typology is going to study the range of variation of a particular phenomenon. So you can have phonological typology. This is the range of variation and diversity in sound systems. You can have morphological typology, the range of variation in sort of the morphological component of the grammar. So things like what kind of affixation is possible? Does suffixation of this imply suffixation of that other kind of morpheme? You can have syntactic typology. You can have all sorts of different kinds of typology. Here we're talking about phonological typology. So we're talking about consonant inventories, and we're talking specifically about gaps in consonant inventories. So you often encounter in like first year phonology this idea that we have an inventory. Let's see if I can get an inventory up. So let's look at Spanish. Let's see if we can see the constant inventory here. So there's an idea that basically there's a tendency for languages to not to have gaps in their inventories. So if you have things going across, if you have places of articulation distinguished in, say, stops, you'll probably have most of those distinguished in the nasals. If you have a voicing distinction in the labials, you'll probably have them in the dentals and the alveolars as well, this kind of thing. So, as you can see, Spanish does have some gaps. We have no dental nasal in this analysis, but we have an alveolar nasal. We have no velar nasal, even though we might expect there to be if we were hardcore gap fillers. We have no voiced. Let's see. No, we never have any voiced fricatives. I guess that technically is. Well, yeah. So as you can see, it's a bit of a messy thing. It's not a generalization that holds 100%. And so the investigation, where is it? There it is. The investigation is trying to investigate. Sorry, the heat is now officially starting to get to me. Solidarity, we can do it. So someone who's interested in the typology of consonant inventory gaps is interested in if there's any sort of rhyme or reason to what kind of gaps are possible. All right, so great. Introduction done. Now we're confronted with this paper, and we have to come in with our sort of our question of interest. So we want to know, what does it mean? I'm going to come up with a thing that we might be interested in coming to this paper. So what does it mean for a consonant inventory to be naturalistic? So this is a kind of a question that a conlanger might ask. And so I know a lot of us in the chat today fit that description. So I think that's a good one for us to go with. Let's see if I can, is the font big enough for you? I think I might need to, there we go. Great. How is that for size? Is that good? What does it mean for consonant inventory to be naturalistic? So this is our kind of research question. This is why we've picked up the paper to begin with. God. Oh, God. Windows. Yeah, okay, I got to find those windows again. Okay, good. Yeah, we're back. All right, so what does it mean for a consonant inventory to be naturalistic? And we may find something interesting about this in this paper. Okay, so first thing we do, reading a paper, we want to look at the abstract if it's there. And this is supposed to give us the sort of the gist of the paper. What is the most important thing in the paper? I think it's worth us copying this over into our notes. And for those following along at home, I have not read this paper at all. This is the first time I've seen it. I think that should probably be fairly obvious from the way I'm taking it in. But just so you know, we haven't gone and made the cake off screen and brought it on. This is all actually real research. Okay, so this is our abstract. We have a new precise algorithmic definition of phonological inventory gap. So we have a definition of the term phonological inventory gap, formal definition, method for identifying gaps. Okay, that's fine. That's kind of in with the definition. Provide descriptive data on several types. So interesting. Types of consonant inventory gaps. Consonant inventory gaps. And relationships between gaps and inventory size. I'm going to use some abbreviations here. Gaps and inventory size. And relationship. I'm going to go really hardcore with the abbreviations. Between gaps and sound change. Relationship between... This X abbreviation I just made up, but I found it very useful when taking notes. X, I just abbreviate ION to X. I don't know if anyone else does that or that's just a me thing. Relationship between gaps and segment borrowing. Okay, cool. So these are the things we'll be on the lookout for. we can probably turn these into little sections. Great. Okay. So let's go. Keywords. Yeah, I mean, I guess those are fine. I think those are there for people searching. Don't have to worry too much about that. Okay, so then generally linguistics papers have a structure, and they're not like most papers in the natural sciences. They have this kind of, so they obviously have an introduction and a conclusion like every paper does, but they tend not to go through the usual sort of like materials and methods, materials, methods, whatever are all the ones that they have, analysis, discussion. It's more freeform than that. So as you can see here, we have usually at the end of the introduction a little, this paper is organized as follows section. And so we have section 2, surveys related work on the subject. Say this is the lit review. So if you want to understand a subject, and a good way to do that is, or like a specific topic, is a good way to do that is go into a recent paper and just find this section. And it will give you a admittedly partial, perhaps biased view, but it'll give you a good view of the sort of history of work on the question. And it's usually the second section. Then section 3 provides definitions of several classes of inventory gaps. So this is where it gets quite freeform. Depends what your next sections are is going to really depend on the paper. So definitions of several classes of inventory gaps. Okay, so essentially it looks like it's going to proceed according to what's described in the abstract, which is good, nice organization. We can see the author says, provide a method for identifying gaps and a definition, then descriptive data of the different types, then investigate these relationships. So it looks like section 3 is the definition and the algorithm. Section 4 is one of the types, within manner. Section 5 is another one of the types, between manner. We'll get into that soon. Section 6 is about the relationship between gaps and inventory size. Section 7 is a relationship between gaps and area. So this macro area is a particular way of coding part of the world in which the language is traditionally spoken. Section 8 then talks about the relationship between inventory gaps and sound change. And then section 9 is gap filling and segment borrowing. And then section 10, obligatory conclusion. So when you're approaching a paper like this is where your question becomes relevant. Because if you are doing this because you need to write a lit review of your own, you probably don't need to pay as close attention to every single section. You will probably want to really hone in on the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. So if we go down to section 10, you'll see the introduction and the conclusion are kind of like the interface of the paper with the outside world, with the future in particular. So the introduction and the conclusion are the ways in which the contents of the paper relate to what the author hopes will be the papers that cite, the paper that cites this work. So that's how I think of it about it anyway. The intro and the conclusion are relationships to the future. The lit review is relationship to the past. There's sometimes some relationship to the past in the introduction as well, especially if they're arguing against someone. Depending on what you're interested in. So if you're interested in tracing the development of a field, you might really care about this, who's arguing against whom, what are the different strains of debate. If you're more interested in the data itself, you probably do not care about that. So if you're more interested in the data itself, you would then just go, look at the intro to orient yourself in the paper, but then you would go to the relevant body section that you're interested in. So if you want to know, what I'm really interested in is what is the relationship between inventory size and gaps, then just hone into the specific section that does that. Obviously, it's good to read the whole thing, but we're not going to focus equally on all of them. Yeah, so I think for us, I'm not super interested in the longer history of this question today. I'm more interested in the data itself. So we will probably spend most of our time looking into some of these body sections. Let's see. I'll give some examples of all of that kind of broad look at the paper structure that I just gave. Here we see, so we're in the introduction. We see the job of the introduction is kind of to set the stage, situate the question. Why is this important? So why are we supposed to think this is an important question? It's because we have, on the one hand, there's a set of consonants that are found in most languages of the world, and it's notable when those are absent. So why does a theory of typology care? Because the theory of typology is trying to establish what the limits of variation are. And if there are certain things that tend not to happen very often, that for some typologists becomes an interesting fact that has to be explained. So a theory of typology will want to account for the fact that these consonants are rarely absent. Yeah, these commonly found consonants are absent, but we also don't want to. Yeah, so let's look at this example. So M is a common consonant. If it's rare, that's something that makes us sort of perk up and say, oh, that's interesting, a language that doesn't have M. Whereas voiced pharyngeal fricatives are rare enough on their own, and we don't consider that to be a gap. Let's see. So that's one definition of gap. And then there's another definition of gap, which is the one that I alluded to earlier, when we have these charts with missing, with cells not filled in that you think might be filled in, because if you go across one way, they're all filled in, and then you go down, they're all filled in, but there's one that's kind of missing. All right. So this is kind of like a conditional notion of, we're surprised to find this consonant not here. So we're surprised to find an M missing, no matter what language we're talking about. But we're not surprised to find an F missing, unless we also see P, B, and V, because we have a kind of paradigm here. We have voiced and voiceless distinction in the stops. We know we have a stop fricative distinction because we have V, but we don't have F. And it seems like if we're used to making the voiceless voice distinction in the stops, we should be able to make that in the fricatives as well, especially if we have the voiced one. Because, well, obstruents, which includes stops and fricatives, are sort of prototypically voiceless. So if you only have one, it's usually the voiceless one. Anyway, and here's another example. So if you don't have B, if you don't have the voiced bilabial stop, is that really a gap? Well, only if you have other voice stops. If you have a language with just PTK, it's not that surprising that it wouldn't have B. If it had three stops and they were pataka, no one's going to say, isn't it weird that it doesn't have B? Okay. So then that's the sort of basis of this paper, or not of this paper in particular, but of the whole question of consonant inventory gaps. And we have some discussion of previous attempts to answer this question. And the motivator for this paper is that people have been speculating about this for a long time, but we don't have comprehensive statistical data. So if we don't have comprehensive statistical data, it's very hard to do a typological investigation of something, because you want to know how common and how rare certain things are, whether they're clumped in certain areas, whether they exist only within certain families. This allows us to disentangle whether something is part of a genetic inheritance of a particular family, it's part of an areal effect, or it's something to do with language itself. However you want to define language itself. Okay, so questions so far about the general approach, about this paper, about typology, about tips for beating the heat. I'll put in a little pause here so that we can chat, because we're doing a bit more hardcore stuff today than normal. So frequent breaks, stretching, hydration, all good stuff. Jake asks, are there examples of typological questions that have been answered? Sort of. There are the kind of like really, really, really robust universals. So things like no language forms questions by reversing the order of words in the sentence. So I eat cake, cake eat I went to the store the to went I. That doesn't happen. So those kinds of questions, those kinds of generalizations have survived, have stood the test of time. Other questions like, what's the relationship between order of verb and object and other sort of word order questions? I think it's fair to say that those have been answered and that we have pretty good data about them and we know what the associations are. But the problem with declaring a typological question answered is, what is our goal in doing typology? Is it to come up with a description of the state of affairs in the world, the distribution of linguistic features? So we have languages that do this, we have languages that do that, and this is a list of the ones that do, and this is a list of the ones that don't. Remember, we only have a finite number of languages. So conceivably, you could finish that job and you'd be done. Or is the job of typology to use that data to allow us to explain some other aspect of language? And I think many linguists, not all, but many linguists fall into the second camp where they, I don't know, don't pin me down on this question today, but they use typology to argue about one particular theory. So the typological data is good evidence for this particular theory of the structure of language, or the typological data is good evidence for this particular reconstruction of this proto-language. Echo's asking, have there been many controversial typological theories? Basically, I think they're all kind of controversial. But any in particular? Well, the big controversy is, what is the role of typology? I think that's where the controversy comes in the most. It's less so that there's one particular proposal about, this universal, people argue back and forth that it's true or it's not. I think it's more, why do we do typology and what is its role? That's where the controversy comes in. Okay, cool. I'm going to put in a little cut for YouTube and then we'll come back. YouTube, we've been researching together. How do you like it so far? I don't know. It's hardcore, but it's fun. We'll get back to it. Come back and we will see you soon.